But remember, everything has come about in stages.
Yeah,
okay?
True.
Right about the same time, Thomas Aquinas was writing.
Mm.
And Thomas Aquinas and some of the other scholastics of his time formulated the basis of what later became Roman Catholic dogma that was adopted into Catholicism, which was the reigning religion of the time. Okay, even though you periodically had a few people that came along who were already saying, "Wait a minute, we've drifted far from the Scriptures. We need to get back to the Scriptures," like Wycliffe, say for example. There's a good point on that. But everything happens in stages. Which is why it's absurd today. You see people saying, well, they should have known 200 years ago that slavery was wrong, and anything that they said, the product of white racist slave owners can't possibly be good. Well, that's nonsense, because where we are today is built on all of the hard philosophical and theological and political work that these people did over the centuries. So Great Britain went through a series of stages in converting its country from a monarchy to much more of a parliamentarian system, limiting the powers of the monarch. And then they came up with the idea of the balances, because remember, as you said, the Magna Carta was a treaty between the king and between the barons at the time. They were tired of getting bossed around by the king who wasn't listening to them, but ain't nobody there that cared about the serfs, right?
Yeah.
Well, later on, you came along with the idea of the House of Commons, the House of Lords. So everybody was represented in Parliament and had a voice. Same thing here in our country. You have a Congress, and it's split between the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. In the House of Representatives, the votes are by population. So that was because the smaller states realized that they were just going to be overrun by the will of the larger states. And they said, phooey on that. Well, the larger states didn't want the smaller states to necessarily tell them what to do. So that was the compromise. Let's do it that way. Very much after the 2 chambers of Parliament in Great Britain.
Yeah, so I also read that in the 1700s, which is around in the late 1700s is where the Bill of Rights was put together, there was a lot of discussion about studying the Magna Carta, and they came out with 3 fundamental rights: the right to life, liberty, and property. And I know that Frederick Bastiat uses those 3 to talk about liberty, to talk about, I suppose, his answer or his rebuttal to socialism. Was there any evidence that the people who were developing the Bill of Rights had any intellectual connection to the 1700 scholars in Britain that were talking about these things?
They were very well aware of all of that. That was very much the discussion of the day if you go and read their papers. And when I went through Monticello, which is the home of Thomas Jefferson, and it was interesting because I would hang back at the tour. They would go in groups through the house. And I would hang back, and going through his library, instead of listening to the tour guide, I was reading the books he had on his shelf and which languages they were written in, because he was fluent in French as well as English. So they were very much aware of the zeitgeist, the philosophical ideas, both in Great Britain and in France at the time. And they had just come out of the Protestant Reformation less than, let's say, 1517 was Luther's 95 Theses. Council of Trent was 1545. So just bump it up 2 centuries. They were very, very aware of all of these theological and philosophical trends. And yes, that's what built into what they were writing.
So it's interesting that, what you said, there's things happen in stages, and we in the modern era, perhaps we're the only people that do this because of our access to information, but we tend to read our world and our definitions and our understandings back into history. Whereas when I talk to people who have either studied theology or study exegesis of the Bible or study history, they train themselves to think in terms of chronological progressions. And so you get a lot of Sorry, go.
which is how history actually happened.
Exactly.
And yeah, and today what they're doing is what I call a theological or legal readback. We try to read back our conclusions in the 21st century and impose them on people in the 18th century or the 19th century. Well, that's an absurdity. It doesn't happen like that. And I remember Professor Jason Hill. He's interesting. He's one of the ones that has opposed what I call wocus pocus over here, in that he's a black Jamaican immigrant to the United States, and he teaches philosophy. And he'll have students come into his class saying, well, we don't need to read, say, for example, John Locke or Descartes, because those are just dead, white, racist, whatever they were, philosophers, economists, therefore. And the absurd conclusion is, oh, they have nothing to say to us. And he would say, why, you arrogant little, whatever. You wouldn't even have the ability to use the word racist if it were not for the work that these men had done. We built over time on these platforms. And the absurdity today is that anything, if you notice, the war is on Western civilization. That's what the war is on. And the Anglosphere, but also parts of Europe, Western Europe, we have been chewing out our own guts since World War II in academia, telling ourselves everything that's wrong with us. I don't know. In Australia, it looks like a lot of people are doing pretty well. Same as in the United States. Why is that? Because of free markets, because of the freedoms we established. And the people who generally talk about how bad, the Western world, the Anglosphere is a no good, very bad, perfectly racist, horrible, awful place, they need to go to third world countries. Take a look at how well Christians are getting along there. Look inside the Islamic world and see what goes on in there today in terms of rights, which is the real irony that the progressive left, which are really the neo-Marxist left, are making an alliance with the radical Islamists around the world. They have nothing in common except for one thing: hatred of Western civilization. And if they ever succeed in getting rid of that, they're going to have to duke it out with each other because they don't agree on anything. All of the rights that the progressive left keeps harping about, the fundamentalist Islamists who are terrorists and other groups, they hate those. They despise those, Like I said, there's no agreement between the two. It's a very rarity in this modern situation.
So